everyone, welcome to AZ Academy USA. Today I'll be reading I Survived, The Sinking of the Titanic, 1912 by Lauren Tarshis. Chapter 1. Monday, April 15, 1912, 2 a.m. on the deck of RMS Titanic. The Titanic was sinking. The gigantic ship had hit an iceberg. Land was far, far away. 10-year-old George Calder stood on the deck. He shivered because the night was freezing cold. And because he was scared, more scared than he ever been. More scared than when Papa swore he sent George to the army school, far from everything and everyone. More scary even than the time the Black Panther chased him through the woods back home in Millerstown, New York. The deck of the Titanic was packed with people. Some were running and shouting, "Help us! Take my baby! Jump!" Some just plain screamed. Children cried. A gunshot exploded across the deck. But George didn't move. Just hold on, he thought himself, gripping the rail. Like maybe he could hold up the ship. He couldn't look down at that black water. He kept his eyes on the sky. He'd never seen so many stars. Papa said Mama watched over him from heaven. Could Mama see him now? The ship lurched. "We're going down," a man shouted. George closed his eyes, praying this was all a dream. Even more terrible sounds filled the air. Glass shattering, furniture crashing, more screams and cries. A bellowing sound like a giant beast was dying a terrible death. George tried to hold the rail, but he lost his grip. He tumbled, smashing his head on the deck. And then George couldn't see anything. Even the stars above him seemed to go black. Chapter 2. 9 hours earlier, Sunday, April 14th, 1912, 7:15 a.m. First class suite, B-deck, RMS Titanic. George woke up early that morning, half expecting to hear Papa calling him for chores. But then he remembered the Titanic. He was on the greatest ship in the world. It was their 5th day at sea. George and his 8-year-old sister Phoebe had spent 2 months in England with her Aunt Daisy. What a time they had! As a surprise for George's 10th birthday, Aunt Daisy took them to see the Tower of London, where they used to chop off your head if the king didn't like you. Now they were heading back to America, back to Papa and their little farm in upstate New York. George got out of bed and knelt by the small, round window that looked out on the ocean. "Morning," said Phoebe, peering through the silk curtains of her bed and fumbling for her spectacles. Her curly brown hair was practically standing straight up. "What were you looking for?" George had to smile. Phoebe always had a question, even at the crack of dawn. Maybe that's why she was the smartest little sister in the world. "I thought I saw a giant squid," George said, "and it's coming to get us." George rushed over and grabbed Phoebe with wiggly squid arms. She curled up into a ball and laughed. She was still laughing when Aunt Daisy came in. Even in her robe and slippers, Aunt Daisy was the prettiest lady on the whole ship. Sometimes George couldn't believe she was so old. 22! "What's this?" Aunt Daisy said. "You know the rule. No having fun without me." Phoebe sat up and put her arms around George. Georgie said he saw a giant squid. Aunt Daisy laughed. "I wouldn't doubt it. Everyone wants to get a look at the Titanic, even sea monsters." George halfway believed it. He never imagined anything like the Titanic. Aunt Daisy called the ship a floating palace. But it was way better than the cold and dusky castles they seen in England. They had 3 whole rooms, one for Phoebe and George, one for Aunt Daisy, and one for sitting around and doing nothing. They even had a man, a steward named Harry. He had bright red hair and an Irish accent that made everything he said like a jolly song. Some fresh towels for your bath, he would say. Some cocoa before bed. And just before they turned out the lights for the night, Henry would knock on their door and peep his head in. Is there anything else you might need? He asked. George kept thinking of something he needed. But what could you ever need on the Titanic? The ship had everything, even a swimming pool with ocean water heated up like a bath, even silk curtains for your bed so you could pretend you were sleeping in a parent's den, even 3 dining rooms where you could eat anything you wanted. Last night, George had eaten 2 plates of roast beef, veal, and ham pie, carrots as sweet as candy, and a mysterious dessert called meringue pudding. It tasted like sugary clouds. Actually, there was one thing missing from the Titanic: the New York Giants baseball team. George wondered what Harry would say if George said, "I need shortstop Artie Fletcher right away." Probably Harry would say, "Coming right up, sir." George grinned just thinking about it, but Aunt Daisy wasn't smiling at him. She looked very serious. "We have to make the most of our last 3 days at sea," Aunt Daisy said in a low voice. "I want you to promise me, George, no more trouble." George gulped. Was she still mad at him for last night? He slid down the banister of the grand staircase in the first-class lobby. How could he resist? The wood was so shiny and polished, curving around like a fair ride. "That lady could have moved out of the way," George said. "How could she?" Phoebe said. She was wearing 1,000 pounds of diamonds. Aunt Daisy almost smiled. George could tell. No, she could never stay mad at George for long. Aunt Daisy put her face very close to George's. She had freckles on her nose, just like George and Phoebe. "No more trouble," she repeated, tapping his chest. "I don't want to have to send a telegram to your father." George's stomach tightened into a baseball. "Don't tell Papa," Phoebe said. "He'll send George away to the army school." "I'll be good," George promised. "I will, really." "You better be," Aunt Daisy said. Chapter 3. George didn't mean to get into trouble. It's just that he got these great ideas. Like our first day at sea, when he climbed up the huge ladder into the crow's nest. "Aunt Daisy," he yelled, waving his arms. She looked up, and she almost fainted. And yesterday, George had explored the whole ship. Aunt Daisy kept warning him that he'd get lost. She said the ship was like a maze, but George could always find his way, even in the huge forest that stretched out behind their farm. Mama used to say that George had a map of the world behind his eyes. He saw the engine rooms and the boiler rooms, and wound up on the third-class recreation deck. He was watching some boys play marbles when he noticed that he wasn't alone. A little boy was staring at him with huge eyes the color of amber glass. "See, see," the boy said, and he held up a postcard of the Statue of Liberty. He looked so proud, like he carved that big lady himself. George felt like he had to show something in return, so he took out his good luck charm, the Bowie knife Papa had given him for his 9th birthday. He let the little boy run his fingers around the handle, which was carved from the elk's antler. "Enzo," the boy said, puffing out his chest and pointing to himself. "George," said George. "Giorgio." the little boy cried with a smile. The man near them laughed. He was reading an Italian-English dictionary and had the same huge eyes as the boy. George guessed right that he was Enzo's father. "Marco," he said, shaking George's hand, "you are our first American friend." Marco must be studying that dictionary pretty hard because George understood everything he said. George learned that Enzo was 4 years old. He lost his mama too. He and Marco came from a little town in Italy, and now they were moving to New York City. George told Marco about their farming and their trip and explained that any decent person living in New York had to be a Giants fan. For some reason, Marco thought that was funny. When it was time for George to leave, Enzo got very upset. "Giorgio!" he howled loud enough for the whole ship to hear. People stared and put their hands over their ears. Marco promised that he'd see George again, but Enzo wouldn't quit howling. George had never heard anything so loud. By the time Enzo let go of George's leg and George ran up to the suite, Aunt Daisy was practically howling too. "I saw you fell overboard," she cried. But even then, she wasn't really mad. She didn't get really mad until last night. How that lady screamed when George came sliding down the banister, like he really was a giant squid. George didn't mind getting yelled at. He was used to it. Not a day at school went by without Mr. Landers shouting, "George, settle down," and Papa. Well, he was always mad at George, but not on Daisy. And being on this trip was supposed to make her happy. Happy for the first time since her husband died last year. It had been Uncle Cliff's dream to be on the maiden voyage of the Titanic. He struck it rich selling automobiles and had plenty of money to pay for one of the biggest suites on the ship. When Uncle Cliff had his accident, George was sure Aunt Daisy would cancel their trip. Instead, she invited George and Phoebe to go with her. And George's shock, Papa said they could. "Your aunt's going on this trip to find a little peace," he said to George. "I expect you to be a perfect gentleman." And if it wasn't, George knew he'd be shipped off to the army school for sure. Papa had been talking about the place ever since George had brought the 2-foot rat snake to school to show Mr. Landers because they were studying reptiles. George had been perfect the whole time in England. He let Aunt Daisy drag him into a fancy clothes store for a new pair of boots. He even learned to drink tea without spilling it back in the cup. But while the Titanic, the ship gave him so many great ideas. But now, he'd really be perfect. No more ideas for the rest of the voyage. Chapter 4. Phoebe wasn't taking any chances with George. "I'm not letting you out of my sight," she announced after they finished breakfast. "I'm your guardian angel." "I didn't know angels wore spectacles," he said, tugging on one of Phoebe's curls. "The smart ones do," Phoebe said, grabbing George's arm. She offered him a lemon drop from the little silver tin she'd be carrying around since London. George made a face. He hated us old lady candies. George wanted to go find Marco and Enzo and hear more about Italy. He wanted to ride the elevators up and down. Hardly any other ship in the world had elevators. Better yet, he wanted to find Mr. Andrews, the ship's designer. When Mr. Andrews had stopped by their table at dinner the first night, George thought he was just a boring near coming over to kiss Aunt Daisy's hand. But Mr. Andrews was different. "You built the Titanic?" said George. Mr. Andrews smiled. "Not by myself. It took thousands of men to build her. But I didn't design her, that's true." He wanted George and Phoebe to come with him to the first-class writing room. He unrolled the ship's blueprints across a long polished table. It was like looking at the skeleton of a giant beast. "She's the biggest moving object ever built," Mr. Andrews explained. 14 stories tall, 45,000 of steel, and longer than 4 city blocks. "Our aunt says nothing bad can happen to the ship," Phoebe said. "People say it's unsinkable." "No ship is safer," Mr. Andrews said. "That is certainly true." "But what if the Titanic was hit by a meteor?" said Phoebe, whose latest obsession was outer space. She was determined to see a shooting star before they docked in New York. Mr. Andrews didn't laugh or roll his eyes like Mr. Landers did when Phoebe asked her questions. "I hadn't planned on any meteors hitting the ship," Mr. Andrews said thoughtfully, "but I like to think she could take almost anything and still float." Phoebe seemed satisfied. "Are there any secret passages?" said George. Mr. Andrews studied his blueprints and pointed to the boiler rooms. "There are escape ladders," he said. "They run up the starboard side of the ship, up to decks, through the stoker's quarters, and into their dining hall. I hear the crew likes using them instead of the stairs." George could have stayed there all night. He asked a million questions, and Mr. Andrews answered every single one. "I was like you when I was a boy," Mr. Andrews said just before Aunt Daisy came to haul George off to bed. "One day, I predict you'll build a ship of your own." George knew that would never happen. He could barely get through a day at school. But he liked that Mr. Andrews said it, and he sure wanted to find those secret ladders. But Phoebe had different ideas. First, she dragged George to the first-class library so she could check out a book on Halley's Comet. Then she took him on a walk on the boat's deck. He felt like a dog. "Strange," Phoebe said, looking at the lifeboats that hung just off the deck. "There are only 16 boats. That's not nearly enough for everyone." "The ship's unsinkable," George said. "So do we really need lifeboats at all?" Phoebe stared at the boats and shrugged. "I guess you're right," she said, and then she announced that it was time to see how many ladies were wearing hats with blue feathers. George groaned. This would be the most boring day of his life, but at least nobody was yelling at him. Chapter 5. At dinner that night, Aunt Daisy raised her glass. "To George, no trouble for one entire day." They clinked their glass together just as an old man stopped by their table. "Mrs. Key," the man said to Aunt Daisy, "I've been meaning to say hello." "Mr. Stan," Aunt Daisy said. "What a pleasure. This is George, my nephew, and Phoebe, my niece." Mr. Stan nodded hello. "So," Aunt Daisy said, "what brings you on to this magnificent ship?" "Oh, I couldn't miss it," he said. "I think all of society is on this ship. I hear there's even an Egyptian princess on board." "Really?" Aunt Daisy said. "I haven't met her." "Well, none of us have. She's traveling in the first-class baggage room." "Excuse me?" Aunt Daisy said. "The princess is more than 2,500 years old," Mr. Stan said. George's ears perked up. "I'm not sure I understand." She's the mummy. A mummy? Phoebe gasps. That's right, Mr. Stetson. From a tomb near Thebes. I understand she belongs to a man named Mr. Burroughs. People are saying that he sold the coffin to the British Museum. Then he packed the princess herself in a wooden crate. Apparently, he's bringing her back for his collection. Some say it's bad luck to take a mummy from his tomb. I'm glad I'm not the superstitious type, Aunt Daisy said. Mr. Stead chuckled. In any case, nothing can harm this ship, not even the curse of a mummy. Mr. Stead tipped his hat and said goodbye. Mr. Stead is a very famous writer in England, Aunt Daisy said. You never know who you'll meet on the Titanic. And then it hit George. The best idea ever. That mummy. He had to see it. Maybe this day wasn't so boring after all. Chapter 6. George didn't tell Phoebe or Aunt Daisy about his plan. He figured he'd head down to the first-class baggage room after they went to sleep. He'd find Mr. Burroughs' crate, pry it open, and take a quick peek at the mummy. He'd be back in bed and snoring away before everyone knew he was gone. It was almost 11:15 when Phoebe was finally asleep and the light was out under Aunt Daisy's door. George crept out of bed. He quickly got dressed and put his knife in his pocket. He needed for prying off the lid of the crate. And who knew, maybe there was a live cobra in the box too. George could hope, couldn't he? George opened the door and peeked into the hallway. He wanted to avoid Harry, who seemed to have eyes at the back of his bright orange head. He wouldn't like George creeping around so late at night. But the hallway was quiet. There was no noise at all except for the quiet hum of the engines, rising up from the bottom of the ship. George loved that noise. It made him think of crickets in the woods at night. In fact, being out here all by himself reminded him of the nights at home when he sneaked out into the woods while Papa and Phoebe were asleep. He had out when his mind was filled with restless thoughts about why Papa was always mad at him, or why didn't he try harder at school. And of course, Mama. Almost 3 years has passed since she died. George tried not to think about her too much, but some nights when he closed his eyes, he remembered her smell, or her smell when she hugged him close, like fresh grass and sweet flowers. And that song she sang to wake George up in the morning. Awake, awake, it's now daybreak, but don't forget your dreams. Thinking about Mama was like standing close to a fire. Warm at first, but get too close and it hurt too much. Much better to stay clear of those thoughts. Nothing cleared George's mind quicker than being in the woods. He never stayed out for more than an hour or two, except for that night back in October. George was heading back toward home when he heard a terrible sound, like a little girl screaming. He turned around, and in the dark distance, he saw 2 glowing yellow eyes. Some old-timers said there were black panthers in the woods, but George never believed it. As the yellow eyes got closer, George could see the outline of a huge cat with 2 glistening fangs. George told himself not to run. He knew that he'd never outrun the panther. But he couldn't help it. He ran as fast as he could. Branches cut his face, but he didn't slow down. Any second, the panther would leap up and tackle George. Its claws would tear him apart. George could feel the cat right behind him. He could smell its breath, like rotting meat. George grabbed a fallen branch. He turned it and waved it in front of him. The panther lunged and grabbed the branch in its jaws. George let go of the stick and scrambled up in the tree, climbing as high as he could. The cat dropped the branch and came after him like a shadow with glowing eyes. George pulled out his knife. He waited until the cat's front paws were on the small branch just below him, and then, with all his might, he chopped at the branch with his knife. Crack! The branch broke free. The giant cat tumbled through the air, screaming and crashing through the branches, and then it hit the ground with a thud. There was silence. And then the cat stood up. It looked up at George for a long moment, and then it turned and walked slowly back into the woods. George stayed in the tree until it was just about light. He made it to bed just before Papa woke up. His friends at school refused to believe George when he told them, even when he swore on his heart. No way, big fat lie. Next thing you say is that you've been stung by giants. Their laughter rose up around George, but it didn't bother him, because right then he realized that it didn't matter what they thought. George knew they faced down the panther, and he never forget it. Chapter 7. Just thinking about the mummy made George happy. He went down 5 flights of stairs to G-Deck and practically skipped along the long hallway toward the front of the ship. He ducked into doorways for a few times to hide from the night stewards. But he had no trouble finding his way, not like Phoebe, who got lost walking from the dining room to the washroom. Next time, I'll leave a trail of breadcrumbs. Like Hansel and Gretel, she said, their first day on board. How about lemon drops? George had suggested. Phoebe had giggled. The hold was in the very front of the ship, past the mail sorting room and the cabins where the stokers and firemen stayed. Too bad, George thought. There was no time to sneak in and see the escape ladders. Luckily, there were 2 more days at sea. George walked right through the doors of the first-class baggage room and down a steep metal staircase that led to the hold. All around him were crates and trunks, and bags neatly stacked on shelves and lined up on the floor. It took him a minute to figure out everything was arranged in alphabetical order, by the owners' names, and a few minutes to find the bees. And there it was, a plain wooden crate stamped with the words, Mr. David Burroughs, New York City, contents fragile. George smiled to himself. This was going to be easy. He took up his knife and started to pry off the lid. He worked carefully, prying each nail loose so he'd be able to close the crate tight again when he was finished. He made it halfway around when he heard a strange sound. The hair on his arms prickled. It was the same feeling he had on the night of the panther, that someone or something was watching him. George stared at the crate, his heart pounding. And before he could even take a breath, something leaped out of the shadows and pushed him to the ground. George looked up, half expecting to see a mummy rising out of the crate, her arms reaching for George's throat. But what he saw was almost as terrifying. It was a man with glittering blue eyes and a scar running down his face. He grabbed George's knife out of his hand. The man was small but very strong. I'll take this, he said, admiring it. Then he looked George up and down. So, the man said, trying to fill your pockets with some first-class loot. George realized he must be a robber. George had caught him in the act. No, the man pointed to George's boots. Which trunk did you steal those from? Cost more than a third-class ticket, I say. George shook his head. I got them in London, he said, and too late realized he made a mistake. Ah, a prince from first class, the man said with a hearty laugh. Just down here for a little thrill. What's your name? George, said George softly. Prince George, the man said, bowing in a joking way. A pity those boots won't fit me, he added, standing up. But you do have something I like. Your key. Always wanted to see one of those first-class cabins. There was no way George could let his man up to the suite. He jumped overboard before he let him near Aunt Daisy and Phoebe. There's some money down here, he blurted out. It's worth millions. It's in that crate. The man raised an eyebrow. George kept talking. I thought I could sneak off the ship and sell it in New York. My father's business is bad. I thought if I could sell it. The man looked at the crate. I like the way you think, he said. He waved the knife at George and told him not to move. And then he quickly worked his knife around the lid. Obviously, he'd done this many times before. He lifted the lid off the crate, but before either of them could look inside, there was a tremendous rumbling noise, and the entire hold began to shake so hard that George almost fell. The shaking got stronger and stronger, the noise louder and louder, like thunder exploding all around him. A trunk tumbled off a shelf and hit the scar-faced man on the head. The knife clattered to the floor, but George didn't try to get it. Here was his chance to escape. He spun around, ran up the stairs, and darted out the door. Chapter 8. George ran as fast as he could down the hall. He heard shouting behind him, but he didn't stop until he was back on B deck, safe again in first class. A steward hurried past him with a stack of clean towels. Good evening, sir, he said. George nodded, out of breath. Nothing could happen to him up here, he knew, so why was his heart still pounding? It was the ship, he realized. That thundering noise, that shaking in the hold. Had a boiler exploded? Had a steam pipe burst? An eerie silence surrounded him, and George's heart skipped a beat as he realized that the engines had been turned off. The quiet rumbling had stopped. Just outside, George heard people talking loudly. Did they know what was happening? George went out onto the deck and walked over to a small crowd of men. Most were still dressed in their dinner tuxedos and puffing on cigars. They were standing at the rail, pointing and laughing at something happening on the wall deck, one level below. What was so funny? George squeezed between two men and over the rail. At first, he was sure his eyes were playing tricks on him. It looks like the wall deck had been through a winter storm. It was covered with ice and slush. A bunch of young men, tattered clothes and hats, were pelting each other with balls of ice, roaring with laughter like kids having a snowball fight. What's happened? Asked the man who walked up behind George. The ship nudged an iceberg, said the old man with a bushy mustache. He didn't sound worried. An iceberg? Is that why they stopped the engines? Said the new man. Because some ice on the deck? Just being cautious, it seemed, following regulations, said the old fellow. I spoke to one of the officers. She assured me we'll be underway any moment. Hey there, he yelled down at the young man below. Toss some of that ice up here. One of the gang picked up a piece of ice the size of a baseball. He threw it, but the man with a bushy mustache missed. George reached out and made a clean catch with one hand. The crowd cheered. George held up the ice and smiled. Then he held it up to the man. Keep it, son, he said. There's plenty for everyone. The piece of ice was heavier than George had expected. He sniffed it and wrinkled his nose. It smelled like old sardines. More ice balls came sailing up from below. The men jostled to catch them. Their laughter and cheers rose up around George, and the fear he felt in the baggage hold faded away. From up here on the deck of this incredible ship, George felt powerful. Nothing could hurt him on the Titanic. Not even a meteor falling from space, not a giant squid, not the Scarface Man. George squinted out into the distance, hoping to see an iceberg, but the sea faded into darkness. His teeth were chattering now. It was so much colder than it had been at dinner time. He wanted to be back in bed, curled up under his fancy first-class seats and blankets. The corridor was still quiet as George crept toward his suite. As he was letting himself in, he stepped on something that made a crunching sound under his boot. At first, George thought it was ice or a piece of glass. But when he picked up his heel, he saw that the carpet was covered with yellow crystals. George smiled. It was just one of Phoebe's lemon drops. George let himself in, easing the door shut. Phoebe's bed curtains was closed. The light under Aunt Daisy's door went off. George quickly changed into his pajamas and climbed into bed. Yes, he was safe, he told himself. He tried to go to sleep, but as the minutes tickled by, his mind got restless. It hit him that the knife was gone forever, and the total silence of the ship seemed to press down on him. Why hadn't the engine started up again? He lay wide awake, listening and wondering. It was almost a relief when he heard someone knocking on their door.